Booktube, today we're talking about the top 10 history books that I read in 2024. Now, as of this recording, I've read 50 history books this year. Pause right there. I did a video on how to read more. Watch that if you're about to comment based on that statement. Now let's run it back. I've read 50 history books this year, and these are the cream of the crop. And I'm really happy with the diversity of the subjects. We've got American, Islamic, African, Roman, Greek, Asian, and European topics all hit on in this list. This year, I really tried to read more history from around the world, and I think that paid off with some real hits. And not only that, it sparked my interest in so many different areas of history that I hadn't really dug in on yet, which sets me up for 2025 quite nicely. Now, a big reason I had so many bangers this year is not only my own research into them and stalking historians and their recommendations, but all of the recommendations from my community given to me in my quest. So I'll continue to ask you to help me out there. I'd love to know in the comments the best history book that you've read this year, or just in general. I don't want to pigeonhole you or limit you in your options. Just hit me with some top-notch recs, and I promise I will look into them. Now, we have so many books to cover, and I want to get to it. So real quick, please check out all the other efforts on my link tree, which is in the description in my bio. And you can check out our Sickos community on Bindery, where you can join our community of passionate book enthusiasts. And then you can hop in the Sickos Discord, where we have chat on books, entertainment, lifestyle stuff, and so much more. All right, obligatory calls to action, done and dusted. Let's pitter patter, get at her. Now, I only have a couple of rules for this. Rule number 1, no rereads. So even though Agrippina by Emma Southern and Iris Chang's book on the Nanking Massacre, those are books that I gave 5 stars this year, I won't be including those because I've read those before. Number 2, I'm being a touch loose with the term history book so that I can include like nonfiction and biographies that still contain a good deal of historical content beyond the figure being covered. This probably only matters to me. Anyway, let's crack this banana. I have a tie in the 10th spot that I don't feel like breaking, and that's between White Malice by Susan Williams and Say Nothing by Patrick Radden Keefe. I did a full review on Say Nothing in a video where I talk about all the books that the History Sickos Book Club read last year, or this year, still 2024. So that's going to save me some time on this one. Simply put, this covers a period in Northern Ireland known as the Troubles, using the framework of a mystery surrounding a kidnapped mother of 10 to explore individuals in this conflict. It's a great read for casual history readers needing some narrative to glue the story together, but it will also appeal to more advanced readers too. And going back to White Malice by Susan Williams, as the subtitle suggests, this is about the CIA in Africa and all the nefarious, underhanded, covert shit they did to subvert African independence movements so they could keep their grubby hands on more uranium during the Cold War. This all kicks off with the 1958 Hands Off Africa Conference, which marked a significant movement for Pan-Africanism, and it was a display of political unity among emerging leaders. The extensive research that Williams pours into this is impressive and overwhelming. Case by case, she details the depth and breadth of CIA operations in Africa. They infiltrated every facet of political life to destabilize nationalist leaders like Nkrumah of Ghana and Lumumba of the Congo, I think I said that correctly, who were using the USA's own revolution from the British as a blueprint, even calling the ultimate goal the United States of Africa. And these disruptive operations changed the continent's future and strikes an arrow in the heart of the narrative that African nations failed to build effective democracies independently. It is a frustrating and enthralling read. It's also encouraged me to read more about the subject. It's awesome. I would highly recommend it. At number 9, we have Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder. This covers 3 periods of genocide perpetrated by the Germans and Russians from 1932 to 1945. And the area Snyder is calling the Bloodlands for this is where the Germans and Russians overlapped and interacted, which means there is heavy coverage on Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, etc. And an estimated 14 million lives were lost in this area alone in the span of that 12-year period. This book kicks off with coverage on the Holodomor, aka the Ukrainian famine. You also get coverage on the mass shootings in Poland, the starvation of prisoners of war, and of course, the Holocaust. This is a disturbing study and a strong warning about what military forces are capable of when unbridled by ethical morality. This really hammers home how these two totalitarian regimes created the conditions to make so many people unintentional collaborators. Snyder notes that the moral danger in these circumstances is not that one might become a victim, it's that one might become a perpetrator or bystander while also exploring what's called negative opportunism. For example, hoping to avoid a worse fate by reporting on the family the far next over thinking this choice will save your family from starving. Now, I do recognize that this book is controversial in some circles. There's also a public feud between Snyder and another World War II historian, Richard J. Evans, that seems to stem from a negative book review that Snyder gave Evans in 2009, which honestly, I'm here for that level of petty, but at the end of the day, I'm going to let the real historians and the people on Reddit pretending to be historians to hash all that out while I just watch with my popcorn and continue to read more on this subject. Anyway, this is a scholarly yet readable book. It's gruesome but necessary, and I would recommend reading it, and others like it. Number 8 is Messalina, Empress, Adulteress, Libertine, the story of the most notorious woman of the Roman world by Honor Cargill Martin. A little background on Messalina first. She was born in maybe 20 AD in Rome. We don't know for sure because sources don't really care about when women were born. Her cousins were Nero and Caligula. She's the great-grandniece of Augustus. Basically, she is royal stock, silver spoon, trust fund baby all the way. Now that background helps her become the third wife of Claudius, who becomes emperor a few years later after Caligula is murdered by his closest advisors for being a prick. Or maybe not, who knows. I tend to think he got at least a shade of bad PR, but whatever, that's not the point here. The point is, in her teenage years, Messalina is pulled into this court of Caligula, where she's surrounded not only by luxury and sex and depravity, but she's also surrounded by constant danger and has to learn how to play the game of power politics in this unstable atmosphere. Like, if you're Messalina, you're looking around at all of these other women trying to play the same game, and they are having a rough go of it. They're being exiled. They're being forced to off themselves. They're being accused of adultery. And it's when she becomes empress that her story really picks up. And Honor Cargill Martin does a fantastic job playing detective here. She's examining the evidence in the sources, she's laying out all the claims and taking them apart and putting them back together to give us something more grounded in reality, something that's more consistent with Messalina's possible motivations and actions. She has to do this because ancient sources, just like all humans writing history and humans in general, have an agenda. I mean, Tacitus, take him for example, one of the primary sources here. He only uses women in his story to blame them for something, and he has an axe to grind against the Julio-Claudians specifically, who have caused Rome to drift towards embracing a monarchy. Now, women in power are a useful symbol for Tacitus as Rome becomes increasingly distant from its senatorial roots and values. In this period, women have unprecedented power. They have influence. They're in the inner circle. And in Messalina's case, she shares the emperor's bedchamber, and she has his ear. She uses this influence to great effect, which to Tacitus is just another example of decay, right? Women with power are just another symptom of Rome rotting from within. Now, we can never know for sure, but it's definitely possible that all this went into his portrait of Messalina, which paints her as a sex-crazed adulteress, hungry for power. And it's that image of her that has stuck with Messalina for centuries, to the point where she became a meme for hypersexuality. In the face of that, I still think Honor Cargill Martin does a fantastic job in unpacking each takedown without overcorrecting. And that to me is more interesting and useful than taking the sources at face value, despite their obvious prejudices. Cargill Martin also highlights the same type of character assassinations used against her contemporaries, and they really are all pulled out of the same playbook, which should at least make you a little suspicious. And again, in the end, who knows the real truth? But I found this reconstruction of Messalina's incredibly fascinating life to be honest and wildly compelling. Number 7, Olympias by Elizabeth Carney. There is a lot of unknown about Alexander the Great's mother, Olympias, who is one of my favorite figures of the ancient world, regardless of gender. Some think she's a ruthless, savage figure that in her religious cultist fanaticism slept with snakes in her bed. Some think that she arranged the assassination of her husband, Philip II, to advance Alexander's career. Regardless of what you believe, she had a wild life that is often overshadowed by her son, and her story is worth examining, which is exactly what Carney does here in this scholarly work. Now, Olympias is the first woman to play a major role in Greek political history, and for a long time, she played the role really well. She protected the interests of herself and her offspring. She had a tumultuous marriage with the most powerful Greek in the world at the time, who was the man who set the stage and laid the path for Alexander's future successes. And her feuds either ended with a brutal end for her or her enemies, or they kicked off a multi-generational war between rival clans. She guided Alexander to the best of her ability And when he passed and his empire fractured, she led troops into battle against a rival army who, upon seeing her, defected to her, ending the battle before it began at the mere sight of her. This is an incredibly powerful woman who became notorious among the Greeks, and their coverage of her is unfavorable and hostile, to say the least. And Carney's aim in this monograph is to examine the sources and their motivations to tease out what she believes was the most likely to occur. And I think she succeeds in this. She doesn't deny that Olympias was a brutal person, but with a level head and a nose for BS, Carney frames her argument in the context of other men of the period and culture to explain the political and personal motivations that don't typically get covered by the ancient sources when talking about Olympias. This follows her timeline line by line and dissects what we thought we knew about Olympias. And it's very detailed in its analysis. It is superbly researched. And it's not going to read like something you grab at a Barnes & Noble display table, but it's still accessible and readable. I mean, I inhaled this thing in a period of 24 hours, and I highlighted the heck out of it. She gets to the point, and I found this treatment well argued. And with a focal point like Olympias, this was ultimately a thrilling read and one that I will happily revisit someday. Number 6 is Sengoku Jidai, Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Ieyasu, Three Unifiers of Japan by Danny Chaplin. This is another scholarly work that is a deep dive, thick boy, covering this period, which is known as the Sengoku period, or the Sengoku Jidai, or the Warring States period. This takes place in Japan from 1467 to 1568, and it's a bloody and turbulent time where rival warlords and their numerous pseudo-sovereign fiefdoms fought tooth and nail for control of pieces of Japan. This doesn't jump straight into this crazy period. It's going to set you up with important background like the origin of Japan, the formulation of the shogunate, explaining the concept of Gekkokoju, which literally means the lower rules the high, referring to the act of like a lower class individual and or subordinate overthrowing a highly ranked political or military individual to seize power, which is a concept that defines this era. Then you get into the rise of the Oda and really start to dive in on these three figures that rose to prominence in the later portions of this period. There's a well-known story in Japan about these three that works really well to get an idea of who you're dealing with when it comes to this trio. The story goes something like this. Quote, Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Ieyasu were sitting together watching a cuckoo bird and waiting for it to sing, but the bird would not sing. Nobunaga said, "Little bird, if you don't sing, I will kill you." Hideyoshi said, "Little bird, if you don't sing, I will make you sing." Then Ieyasu said to the little bird, "Little bird, if you don't sing, I will just sit here and wait for you to sing." End quote. These are three very distinct characters. Oda Nobunaga is the spiller of blood, Hideyoshi is the manipulator, and Ieyasu is like the perfect psychologist. And all three of those talents intertwine and interact to create a fascinating piece of Japanese history, one that forever changed the course of Japanese history. The battles, the weaponry, the betrayals, the politics, the cultures, the religions, and everything else in between, it's all covered in here. It features a robust section of footnotes, appendixes, and a tremendous bibliography. In summation, if you're looking for something that's comprehensive, definitive, academic, and trustworthy, this is the droid you're looking for. Number 5 is Nothing to Envy, Ordinary Lives in North Korea by Barbara Demick. Now, I've read a good deal of North Korean defector stories this year that also provided a solid background for the country's history, politics, culture, living conditions, and so on. But if I were to pick not only the best one overall and the best one to start with, I would have to give the nod to Nothing to Envy. The framework for this is really effective. Using 6 North Korean defector stories that span a period of 15 years, Demick explores the effects that this repressive totalitarian regime has on its everyday citizens, telling the history of North Korea from the bottom up. These people are doctors, housewives, students, orphans, and they all have a gripping tale to tell. And Demick's extensive research into and interviews with these 6 subjects provides us with stories of love, familial connections, personal conflicts, their struggles, their triumphs. We also watch their views evolve over time as their eyes are open to harsh realities, followed by a deep sense of betrayal as they shrug off the propaganda and come to believe that their country has let them down in profound ways. And once they escape, you get the individuals having revelations like, for example, Dr. Kim expressing that dogs in China eat better than doctors in North Korea. This is a captivating read that can be tough to stomach at times. And with its zoomed out historical, geopolitical, and geographical coverage, it also serves as a tremendous introduction to the subject. So check out Nothing to Envy by Barbara Demick. Number 4 is King Leopold's Ghost, a story of greed, terror, and heroism in colonial Africa by Adam Hochschild. This book sucked to read, but it's still number 4 for a reason. Let me explain. The real-life villain of this story is a real dickhead. He's King Leopold II of Belgium, and he has this dream of turning Africa into a colony and leads the first European efforts to develop the Congo River Basin. He seizes a ton of land, enslaves untold number of people, and places them under brutal conditions. And in doing so, he killed off roughly half the population in the areas where his grubby little hands touched. So for some background, in 1890, the invention of the inflatable bicycle tire kicked off a rubber boom. And because of the vast resources in the Congo, Leopold became the king of the rubber by sending in armed men to kidnap people and set them to the task with impossibly high quotas. And the enforcement of quotas was marked by unimaginable violence, and the consequences of coming up short included chopping off body parts and the execution of yourself and potentially your family. Now, this was all done under the guise of a humanitarian mission that for a long time fooled the international community, and in succeeding with that deception, he turned Africa into his own personal piggy bank. Now, in this, we also get profiles on individuals, none of whom were perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but these individuals couldn't live with what they saw and decided to do something about it. So in that way, it's an eye-opening account of the atrocities committed by evil people and the courageous heroes who brought their deeds to light, which eventually, after a lot of effort, leads to the first photographic human rights campaign that shocked a world generally convinced of colonialism's civilizing impact. This is thoroughly researched and accessible, and yes, it's also frustrating and infuriating, but I think it's also necessary. Number 3 is A Rome of One's Own, The Forgotten Women of the Roman Empire by Emma Southon. Now, as a side note, the UK title of this is The History of the Roman Empire in 21 Women. And look, I am, once again, asking you to read Emma Southon because you will have the most fun that you've had reading a history book, and she continues to school me on a subject that I've read extensively on. Every time I crack open one of her books, I learn something new. This has 21 brilliant stories about 21 fascinating women, taking us chronologically from the foundation of Rome to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So it's sweeping in its scope as it covers about 1,000 years of ancient Roman history. And I had no clue who some of these women were. And even if I did, Southon would uncover something new about their story for me. And some of the hits includes profiles on Rome's first wife, the secret hero of Rome's first war, Rome's first queen, a Vestal virgin who carried after a room called the penis. Stop it. And one of my favorites, the influential, trend-setting, and controversial queen of gangster chic, Clodia Metelli, who had a hugely entertaining feud with the legendary Roman statesman Cicero. In this, you've also got a treatment on a woman who, quote, lived through a murder mystery, a legal thriller, a home invasion horror movie, and a long saga about a man getting home against all odds while being chased by hired killers, end quote. In all of that I just talked about, that's just covered in part 1. There's a lot more. In every single chapter, there was something where I learned something new. For example, Southon explains Rome's foundation legend better than anyone has in the dozens of books that I've read that either cover it directly or make mention of it. She's so good at making things click in a relatable way. So if I haven't made it clear yet by now, this is not a stuffy scholarly work, and nothing against very serious people. You're doing great. But sometimes I want something to feel like I'm having a conversation with the author. Sometimes I just want some juicy gossip and exciting stories while also learning some hard facts in the process. And that's the delicate balance that Southon strikes. And really, you can tell that Emma truly delights in how messy the Romans are just as much as I do. They're such contradictory and dramatic figures. I love them. I never want to stop reading about them. And if you're wanting to get into ancient Roman history, this would be a great spot to start. And even if you're a more advanced reader on the topic, I think literally everyone could get something out of this. Number 2 is How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America by Clint Smith. This takes us on a road trip across the country where you visit places like Thomas Jefferson's plantation, a cemetery in Virginia, a prison in Louisiana, and these are places that are hiding the history of slavery in plain sight. And it confronts that history while examining the attitudes about it that still exist today. Smith combines historical research, interviews with historians, and at these sites he also talks with our tour guides and visitors of all backgrounds while adding in his own thoughts about these experiences and interactions that can be both eye-opening and frustrating. For example, there is a chapter where Smith attends a celebration of the Sons of Confederate Veterans and United Daughters of the Confederacy, where, obviously there's some lost cause myth being promoted and hung on to there. And the tension in these events and conversations that follow just jumps off the page. And afterwards, Smith explores it further, presenting the historical evidence of each state's declarations and how dedicated they were to maintaining slavery. And this is written so well. Smith is a literal poet, and his lyrical prose shines through it. It is gorgeously written without being overindulgent. And he also has the chops to pull off this stained glass window approach. It is a beautiful arrangement of fragments presented side by side, but it never feels choppy. This is also a deeply personal story for Smith, whose ancestors were enslaved, and his passion and thirst for knowledge in connecting the past with the present is palpable. And he just genuinely seems like a very open-minded and curious person with the patience of a saint. Now, there's a reason that any attempt to shine a light on this particular history is always met with resistance and or attacks from those trying to minimize and obfuscate it. But as Smith points out, it happened, and we need to be willing to grapple with it to have a better understanding of its present-day reverberations. To further that point, Smith says, quote, "What would it take, what does it take, for you to confront a false history, even if it means shattering the stories that you have been told throughout your life, even if it means having to fundamentally re-examine who you are and who your family has been. Just because something is difficult to accept doesn't mean you should refuse to accept it," end quote. My number one history book of 2024 is Destiny Disrupted, A History of the World Through Islamic Eyes by Tamim Ansari. Now, I just gushed about this book in my second video about history books for beginner or casual history readers, so I'd give it the full treatment and rundown there. And this is another that I think appeals to readers of all levels, especially if you're looking to get started in your journey through Islamic history. The long and short of this book is that it chronologically covers 1,500 years of Islamic history in 350 pages, which is a tough task. But Ansari pulls this off brilliantly. It's written in a conversational tone, and Ansari doesn't waste time going too far into the weeds. He presents the case he personally believes based on his research, and he keeps it moving. And part of his aim is to balance the scales in how we understand this history, especially in the West. He starts with this in the introduction, quote, "Throughout much of history, the West and the core of what is now the Islamic world have been like two separate universes, each preoccupied with its own internal affairs, each assuming itself to be the center of human history, each living out a different narrative," end quote. And he states once those narratives began to interact, quote, "one or the other had to give way because the two narratives were cross currents to each other. The West being more powerful, its current prevailed," end quote. So this is not the way that you may be accustomed to hearing these stories, and that in itself holds tremendous value to me. But like I said, I've covered this book before. I'll probably cover it again. For now, saying it's my best history book that I read this year is going to have to do. So that's 10, maybe actually 11 of my top reads of 2024 in the history / nonfiction / biography combined genre that I'm putting in for this video. Again, I want to know the best history book that you've read this year or ever. So comment that, leave a like, subscribe, ring the bell, all this stuff. I appreciate y'all being here through the duration of this video. I hope you got some value of it, and I'll see you on the next one.